Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the thorny issue of Western world and I suppose global demographics and the declining birth rate in the West and the thus declining populations, or at least white populations of the Western world. And what are the ramifications for this, and how are international policymakers viewing this? How are they dealing with it? Now, the globalist cabal, of course, are the biggest players in this one. So we really need to look at their perceptions and their behaviours and the policies that they're forcing on the Western world without the consent of the public. So I just want to look at this wider issue. Now, why is population decline seen as a bad thing? Well, no one actually says why. There's Armageddon catastrophe type scenarios of there'll be no workers, there'll be nobody left, everybody will be gone. But of course, that's absolute and utter nonsense. There'll be no consumers. Thus, economies of scale, production economies of scale, everything will be more expensive. Everything will be significantly more expensive, is the claim. And then there's added ones. There'll be no one, there'll be no doctors and nurses to look after the children, and there'll be no people to look after your parents when they retire and they have to go into, what happens when they get dementia? There'll be nobody will be. And of course, these are all absurd, ridiculous catastrophe scenarios. So I want to work through this because I don't see that catastrophe is automatic or that A follows B in this type of equation. It doesn't, not in my view at least. So let's just go through this now. Another one that gets thrown is, look, unemployment is so low. I mean, there's hardly any unemployment, which is a grotesque untruth, by the way, in the West. So that shows that we need to bring in more third world illiterate peasants. And if you've got a shortage of workers, then the first thing you want to do is go and find an illiterate peasant somewhere, and that'll fix it. That in itself is an absolute absurdity. But let's go through it now. In the communist societies, the socialist communist societies, they had a view that everybody should work, everybody consume, because at least at a sort of a quasi-technical level, this would suggest an economy of maximum efficiency. If everybody works and produces and everybody consumes, that you get then, again, it's an ideological, theoretical sort of view that you get a society and an economy of maximum levels of efficiency. Nobody's not working and everybody's producing and so on. But to achieve that, the communist societies had to create jobs that weren't productive. So you had at least 50%, closer to 60% of the jobs were completely unproductive jobs. They didn't need to exist. They were hugely inefficient, and most people in the economy weren't working a job at all. They were doing nothing. And there's the old adage, that sort of street humor type thing, that we pretend to work. This is in the communist societies. We pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. And the idea that anybody was well off due to their productive work ethic, or you could have, say, an accomplished rocket scientist, for example, might be given a better apartment and given access to Western shops with Western consumer goods. But generally, what would have been the very poorest end of the society, farmers on very marginal land, they were better off in a communist system, but they were already moving into better economic conditions even before the communists came on. So in communist societies, now we're seeing this in the West today, that the vast influx of, and it is vast influx of millions upon tens of millions of illiterate third world peasants coming to the West. The jobs are being created for them. They'll be given preferential treatment, and you see this in the big companies, the public service groups, the quangos, all that sort of thing. Wherever you see competition, market competition diminishing, you see an equivalent increase in the number of created jobs. Deputy assistant, vice president for customer experience, and things like that. There is just an absolute explosion of these sort of jobs, and they're all being filled by minorities, people who have they've lived an affirmative action existence since day one. They've never had to pass a test, never had to achieve merit, never had to produce anything, create anything, and so those people are filling now, I would argue, the majority of jobs in the West today. And in order to compensate for so many incompetent, useless, parasitic people, the economy is becoming less and less competitive and more centrally planned. And so it's heading towards the insane lack of productivity that we saw in the communist societies. And it's moving towards replicating that, and hopefully the Trump presidency will begin to unwind some of that insanity. But that's where it's going. So the idea of productivity itself is already changing. Now, there's also, if you look at, say, the pre-industrial age, productivity wasn't measured by actual productive output. So over the centuries, whether you look at a hunter-gatherer society, they're not looking at how many widgets they make. It's how successful they are in catching dinner for the night, or collecting berries, or digging up edible roots, things like that. So that they have a very different view of productivity. Now, moving through the Middle Ages, or even in the pre-industrial age, productivity was seen very differently. So that the landowner, the aristocrat who owned vast estates, had people to do the work, so they needed to do the work. So they would build these people a house, but it would be through not manufactured goods like bricks or something. It would be through local natural resources that you could get around you. So they would cut, for example, stone, and so the house would be built of stone, so very durable and would last hundreds of years. That sort of thing. They would replace the thatched roof with reeds they'd get in the local area, and so again, nothing was manufactured. It was all local resources that were used. So productivity wasn't a manufacturing output thing, and the people on the farm, the aristocrat's estate would work 1 or 2 days for the aristocrat and 5 days for themselves, or whatever the breakup was. It would vary estate to estate depending on the quality of the land and the season and so on. Now, in terms of productivity, that wasn't really much of an issue. Productivity was human labour, which brings us back to the issue of slavery, which wasn't slavery as it's seen today, one human owning another. It wasn't that. It was labour. It was a labour exchange at the time, and slavery, throughout all human history, was seen as a labour exchange. The idea of owning another was you owned their capacity for labour. You didn't own the person per se, or when it wasn't a moral issue, it was an issue of labour there. So productivity, so say following major upheaval such as major war or floods or plagues, things like that, productivity were looked at. And if you look at, say, Britain or England, the use of water wheels, windmills, things like that, they started to proliferate, particularly during that time, because there wasn't enough workers to grind the grain and do things like that. So other means of powering rudimentary machines were used, such as wind and water and so on. So, but again, the idea of productivity as we see it today, that is enhancing the output of a worker by use of some sort of machine. That's fairly new. It's 200 years old, a little bit more than 200 years old in terms of widespread use of tools and equipment to increase productivity. Now, that meant that a semi-skilled or worker could produce 20, 25, 30 times or even more than just somebody working away. So if you put if you put a spinning jenny, for example, for dealing with textiles, weaving textiles, you put a spinning jenny and a worker on it, they could produce 25 yards of cloth in the same time it would take a worker on their own to produce 1 yard of cloth. So 25 times increase in productivity. Now that equation of how to increase the productivity of a worker, that equation across differing forms of technology, whether it's computers or machinery or a lathe or an excavator or digging machine or whatever it is, it doesn't matter. That's to increase the productivity of the worker. So that fixed equation has pretty much stayed in place for all this time. Now, office work's a little bit different, and service work is a little bit different because you're not producing things in the same way. You have to dig 3 holes, and then you dig the holes, and that's the productive output. But when it hang around in the shop in case a customer comes in to buy something, that's a different thing. Productivity it's a very different concept of how to measure productivity. So the claim that worker productivity has been declining in the Western world isn't because worker productivity has been declining. It's because measurably the most productive work has been sent off to third world countries using the wage arbitrage, cheap wages, and they can dump refuse in the river without any environmental concerns, things like that. That's why so that leaves behind the proportion of service industry jobs then increases relative to the productive jobs, manufacturing jobs in the economy. This in turn creates an artificial decline in productivity. Not that productivity's declined, it hasn't. It's the productivity-based, measurable productivity jobs have been sent offshore. Now, the downside of that is, even though wage arbitrage plays a role in it, is that those jobs get sent away, the manufacturing jobs get sent away from the very productive West into the much less productive third world countries like India and China and so on. So productivity declines. So it takes 6 workers to produce a widget in India, where it takes 1 worker to produce the widget in the West. So productivity overall has massively declined, and that decline in productivity was artificially camouflaged and offset by the wage differential, and that's what's happened there. So productivity actually didn't decline in the West. Again, the productive jobs were sent offshore. Now, we're looking at, however, at a situation where AI and automation of varying sorts, like software, various software programs that pretty much pre-plan. Everything's done by checklist. Everything is done by checklist. It doesn't matter what it is. You can sit down and talk to meet people, and they'll just pull out they have no idea what they're talking about or what's going on. They just pull out the checklist and tick off the boxes. That's the reductionism that's going on, which again isn't increasing productivity. It's just lowering the bar, and everything's done by box ticking and faux certification. Do you have a certification to sweep that floor? You're qualified, then fine. That type of faux qualification that's crept in. But I wanted to sort of go further with this. There's limits to. There are certain jobs where AI can't really do it, or automation can't really do it. For example, plumbing, or a lot of the trades, those sorts of things. Some of the diagnostics can be like say you take a car to a mechanic, and they can plug in some sort of computer, and the car dealership some sort of computer, and go, well, the problem is this, and this, and they just replace those parts, and off you go again. And so the diagnostic level, the skill level involved in diagnostics has just fallen off a cliff. No one can diagnose the problem with your car anymore if the computer doesn't pick it up or isn't super obvious that they don't know, and we'll just simply go through an exercise in replacing car parts until they hit the magic one, and then and you got to pay a lot of money for that because they're replacing lots of parts that don't need to be replaced. But coming to the issue of productivity, there are minor increments of productivity increase that say a plumber can have. They can have high-speed drills, or they can have different pieces of equipment that'll make a job go a little bit quicker. For example, if you go and have your tyres changed, now if I have to take the wheel of the car off, I've got a manual stuff. I've got to use a ratchet or a wrench or something like that, and it takes I don't know, 5 minutes to get a wheel off. Then you go to the tyre, and they've got the wheel off in 30 seconds because they've got the tools to do it. Now, if you're dealing with masses of tyre changes, then you do need those product tools. For a guy just doing it in his garage or something, then it's not that big a deal. But those sort of things can increase productivity. But the productivity increases by increments, and you don't necessarily need high-skilled labour. So the explosion of jobs, and you see this all over the Western world, the amount of jobs that are increasing and where they're increasing are the low-skilled jobs where AI and automation doesn't really have a particularly material effect. Delivering, going around in a van, delivering stuff door to door, flipping burgers or something. Those sort of service industry jobs require sort of one-off checklist type training. They don't require analysis, ability to solve complex problems and so on. So, and now when it comes to the issue of solving complex problems, the vision splendid that's held out is that AI and so on, automation of varying sorts, will solve these things. So it's not simply a case of just very repetitive tasks where a bit of software or some form of automation can solve that, or a checklist can solve it, or deal with it. This is something different again. So the sort of economy that we're moving into, and I think it's inexorable, the sort of economy moving into isn't the economy that is based on the paradigm of how can we make this worker more productive, but how can we replace that worker? And more importantly, something that never needed to be replaced was the middle and upper echelon of knowledge workers being replaced or being made redundant and thus replaced. Now, whenever one group of workers has been replaced, for example, carriage builders before the motor car came along, carriage builders were were put out of work by motor vehicles. Now, some went to work on motor vehicle bodies, but even that was automated. Henry Ford got into that at a fairly early stage, really. But what happened in those economies was where there was the growing population, there was the growing affluence, and there was increasing automation and increasing industrialization of jobs and so on. What happened was that for every one category of jobs that were lost, for example, carriage building, the price of consumer goods declined to such an extent, and more jobs were thus created, that there were new industries appearing all the time, consumer goods industries, new industries appearing all the time, and therefore the demand for workers kept increasing, even though older industries were being replaced. Now, that cycle, an old industry dying but being replaced by 3 new industries, and the price of goods falling to a point where people could purchase these consumer goods, motor vehicles, for example. That paradigm was continued throughout a lot of the Industrial Revolution, and only started it started to disintegrate or splinter, probably is a better word, in the 1980s and 90s, and that splintering has continued, and particularly with sending these manufacturing jobs offshore just for the wage arbitrage benefit. Now, I know this is getting a little complicated, but the way the paradigm has shifted now is that workers are being replaced in certain areas by automation, by checklists, by software, and increasingly by the early stages of AI, if I can use that term. And new industries are not coming to replace them. New jobs are not being created. It's not new industries. Now, where new industries are coming up, and there's some, they're not labour-intensive worker demand industries. They're not generating a lot of jobs. And you can have the artificial thing like the Twitter before Elon Musk, where they were employing thousands of people that did nothing. Again, very much part of that globalist, communist, socialist concept of the economy, create all these jobs for minorities, but they're not actually real jobs. And you saw these young women posting things on online where they would stroll in sort of somewhere between 9 and 10 o'clock. They'd have their caramel lattes, they'd wander around a bit, they'd have to sit in a de-stress room because of the time it took them to get to work or something, and then they'd attend a couple of meetings that they weren't needed for anyway. Then they'd have a lunch, and then they'd have to go to the some other de-stressing room to rest, to recover from having to sit at the meeting, and then they go home, and that to them was just that was just a normal day at work. Those sort of jobs were all over the place. So we've got a situation where the workers are being replaced, or their actual need in the productive economy are being replaced, and those jobs are not being replaced by any new industries or any demand for productive workers, and instead they're being replaced, assuming they're being replaced at all, by communist type jobs, where jobs are simply invented and given to minorities. So what about the influx of people coming into the West? Again, the globalist cabal forcing mass migration. These are not skilled labour, far from it, and the idea of Western economies are short on skills is bullshit. It's an absolute lie. So these illiterate peasants are being brought in, and they're being brought in to flip the burgers, which creates then an artificial economy that couldn't exist in any competitive form of merit. So these are the changes that are going on now. With such a backdrop, is a large and increasing population needed? I would argue no, it's not. Now there'll need to be other structural adjustments in the society and in the economy, but there's a perception that once someone hits 65 and retire from the workforce, that they automatically are afflicted with Alzheimer's and they're quadriplegic and they can't move and they have to be spoon-fed while they slobber everywhere. No, that's not true. There are people I know who are past retirement age and in their 70s and 80s that are still quite sprightly. Not every single one, obviously, but many of them that are. Now, if you this idea of retirement, but people having to go in retirement homes, who's going to look after them, and so on. These people could come and live with their family. Now, the attitudes will have to change in some instances. There, no question of it. But if your parents come to live in the same house, then they can look after the children, and which means you now don't have childcare worries. So you can then go to work full time, maybe get another job, maybe work 2 jobs, which means you suddenly become far more productive than was hitherto the case, because you don't have those childcare concerns. You don't have to, leave work early to pick up the children from school, and those sorts of things. So now on top of that, your parents live with you, so they can do the things like do the shopping and have dinner ready when you come home at night, and so on. So these sorts of things. So when families live together, not that it's always easy, by the way, and you'd have to be brush up on your relationship skills, but it suddenly changes everything in the productivity paradigm. Suddenly you don't need aged care workers. Now you're free to have children and go to work, and so on and so on. So a lot of changes could come through those sorts of things. But we're going into an area of low productivity because fewer productive type jobs are being created, very few in fact, and the jobs that are being created are being artificially filled with minorities purely on the basis of creating pretend jobs, make-up jobs, phantom jobs in the way that they were in the communist economies. I would argue that we're past the 50% mark already. Certainly, by my reckoning, as I go around to any business employing more than a couple of hundred people, there's the majority of the people there, and particularly where they're reliant on government contracts or they've been granted sort of regional monopolies, those sorts of things, they're not having to compete for customers. They don't have to provide good products at the best price or anything like that at all. And they have an unusually large number of parasitic workers there, well, not workers, parasitic attendees that do no productive work. They're just simply there to pretend and act all important and bossy and officious and so on. But that's my view. So declining birth rates and declining population is not a bad thing. People can be more productive and structured to be more productive. And if there aren't the jobs around anyway, then how are we to measure productivity? Must we create pretend jobs? And if so, then why? And that would increase prices in itself, the pretend jobs. And if there are only pretend jobs, then why do Western countries need to be forced to take in masses of third world peasants that will never integrate into the economy anyway? You've been with Tasteless Today, your pushback channel. Thank you for listening.